All right, what's up guys? It's Jack and welcome back to another video. And in this one, I wanted to do a top 10 greatest fighting games of all time personal list. Now, what this means is that these are games that I've personally played. So there's going to be a few games that are worthy of the top 10 best fighting games of all time that are not going to be on this list because I personally haven't played them. For either reasons of just not interested in that particular fighting game or the fact that I just didn't have the hardware to play that fighting game. So therefore, it can't be on my personal top 10 greatest favorite fighting games of all time, so to speak. So I think that this list it took a while to think about, but overall I'm pretty happy with this list, and some of the games on this list may surprise you, and yet some of the games on this list may not surprise you depending on how long you've been here. So without further ado, this is going to be an above average size video, so let's get right into it. So my personal 10 is actually kind of a hot take. So back in 2004, there was a sequel that came out in this great fighting game franchise that basically did it better than the last one and contained content that people are still asking for to this day. My personal number 10 of greatest fighting games of all time is Mortal Kombat Deception, also known as Mortal Kombat 6. Mortal Kombat Deception basically built off of the foundation that Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance presented, because they didn't have to make a new engine anymore. It's the same engine as Deadly Alliance, except it was refined and improved, specifically in the jumping area, and it was also a little bit faster than Mortal Kombat Deadly Alliance, as well as smoother feeling. And the content in Mortal Kombat Deception is absolutely astonishing. You had puzzle combat, you had chess combat, you had conquest mode, which people are still asking for today. Characters, instead of one fatality each, had 2 fatalities plus a harakiri, which is another feature that players have been asking for ever since. Which, for those of you guys that are not familiar, a harakiri is a finisher that you basically can do on yourself. Before your opponent finishes you off, you finish yourself off. So and it was actually quite hilarious, so to speak, and it fits in with the franchise very well. And ever since then, players have been asking for this feature back, and we have yet to have it back ever since, as well as a few characters in that particular game that would actually be pretty nice to have them back in the new Mortal Kombat coming up, MK12, that have yet to be seen since Mortal Kombat Deception. And when you look at it from a content standpoint, Mortal Kombat Deception literally had it all. You had your crypt, full of things to unlock. You had your conquest mode, which was a whole other game in and of itself, chess combat, puzzle combat, and then everything else that Mortal Kombat had to offer. Basically, the fact that fighting games can have so much content on one disc, right, was the start of it all. It's something that carried on with NetherRealm games to this day. And Mortal Kombat 6 or Mortal Kombat Deception also had an antagonist that we haven't seen since then, but also plays a really big part in the story as well. It's just that we haven't seen enough of him. And I personally think that hopefully we'll get that back in Mortal Kombat 12, because again, it's yet another thing that the fans have been asking for. So as far as the 3D fighting game era is concerned of Mortal Kombat Deception beats both Deadly Alliance and Armageddon. And for a multitude of reasons, it brought Mortal Kombat back from what was missing from it in the first place. It brought back stage fatalities, also known as death traps, and it also gave a nod to Mortal Kombat 3. Remember Mortal Kombat 3 when you would uppercut somebody through the ceiling and they would appear on another level or whatnot? Guess what? They kind of did the same thing with Mortal Kombat Deception. So there were plenty of nods to the old games and enough new content for the new game to just bring it all together. And that is why Mortal Kombat is on my personal number 10. Now, my number 9 is a game that had tremendous impact. It basically had variations. There were variations of this game that were in arcades as well. If you went to a bowling alley arcade, you would see probably a variation of this game. If you went to a movie theater arcade, you would probably see a variation of this game. Now, what in the world am I talking about? A variation of the game that I'm about to say as my number 9 is, let's say, Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter, X-Men versus Street Fighter, Children of the Atom. So when you think of these games, what pops in your head as a 2-on-2 tag team fighting game? Marvel vs. Capcom. My number 9 is Marvel vs. Capcom, the original Marvel vs. Capcom. I remember specifically being in an arcade back in the day, And this game was more popular than the other games that were like it, that were the 2-on-2 tag team fighters like X-Men vs. Street Fighter, X-Men Children of the Atom, and Marvel vs. Street Fighter or whatnot. Like, this game had more of a crowd around it, and this game lasted a lot longer. And it's just really interesting to hear that something as simple as a specific roster of specific characters from specific franchises that would make it into the game, that would make it that much more popular. But there was also the fact that there were subtle gameplay differences. But at the end of the day, those 2-on-2 tag team fighting games in the late 90s were definitely something that grabbed a lot of people's attention. And the fact that you could tag in and team up with these two guys from these two different franchises and go at it with another two was pretty cool, especially since you can just tap two buttons at the same time and then your other partner would tag in. Or you could do a specific combination of buttons to where you can start a combo and then your other character can finish off that combo or come in for an assist or something like that. Marvel vs. Capcom was that game that stood out, and it really kind of started, like, it really brought it to like that level of popularity with the foundation that it brought. So Marvel vs. Capcom is it easily belongs on my top 10 list, and that's why I have it at number 9. And unfortunately, for Marvel vs. Capcom, we didn't get like a legit like console port. Like, I think we had it for PlayStation, but basically you couldn't tag in. Like, you couldn't tag in with your partner. It was a 2-on-2, but you couldn't tag in at any time for whatever reason. I don't know what the limitations were behind that, but eventually, I believe it was for the Dreamcast. Then for the Dreamcast, you were actually able to tag in just like you were in the arcade. And I actually had both the PlayStation version and the Dreamcast version. And obviously the big difference, if at all, the Dreamcast version was obviously that the Dreamcast version you could just tag in at any time. So kind of interesting how that wasn't in the PlayStation version, but it was perfectly there and intact in the Dreamcast version. So yeah, Marvel vs. Capcom, my number 9. Now, for number 8, I have a very interesting story with this. I was one of the very few people back in the day as a kid, being about 10 or 11 years old, and owning a Sega Dreamcast. And the Sega Dreamcast, unfortunately, was not a very popular console back in the day. It just wasn't. And however, there was a game for that console that did sell, I believe, better than any other game, a fighting game specifically, for the Sega Saturn. And what game are we talking about? We're talking about Virtua Fighter 2. I played Virtua Fighter 2 in the arcades first, and I always loved the sound to where you put in the tokens or the coins. It would go down, down. So you put in the first coin, it would go down. A very distinct sound. Basically, if anybody's ever played Virtua Fighter, you would instantly remember that sound. So, or those two sounds. And the gameplay of that 3D fighter was unique. The game itself looked unique. And the fact that it played unique and looked unique in terms of 3D and everything, I think is part of what drew a lot of people in. And there are people out there in the fighting game community that are very, very well known in that community that have said that games like Tekken 1 wouldn't exist without Virtua Fighter 2. And games like Smash Brothers wouldn't exist without Virtua Fighter 2. So when you have a game that has had that much impact, a game that I happen to play both on arcade and as well as the Sega Saturn, which I owned, as well as the copy of the game itself, that has had that level of impact, it's just simply something that cannot be ignored. So Virtua Fighter 2, very easily my number 8. Now, my number 7, again, is another unique story of something that happened that I did not expect to happen. This game in particular caught my attention by ear first, before my eyes. Now, granted, I was also influenced by somebody else that was in the arcade that kind of said, hey, dude, you got to try this game. And I wanted to play it, but I was just, for whatever reason, I just didn't think I would get into it, or I was just a little intimidated because it was different. But back in 1994, I was a Mortal Kombat freak. You could not get me away from Mortal Kombat. Every single time I would anticipate the new Mortal Kombat, and every single time I went to the arcade, I played the latest Mortal Kombat that was in the arcade until the new one, whenever that was, would come to be, right? Well, this game in 1994 specifically caught my attention away from Mortal Kombat, and that game was Killer Instinct. Killer Instinct of 1994, the original KI, basically came at a time where Mortal Kombat was in its absolute prime and was one of those games and those game franchises that was looked at as being the king of fighting games back in that day. And then here comes the game Killer Instinct with a killer soundtrack. It was the first fighting game to play at 60 frames per second. The graphics were absolutely crisp. The combo system was something that was incredible and addictive and fun to watch and fun to play. The soundtrack to the game was absolutely top notch, and the announcer as well is one of the best announcers in fighting game history, hands down. And that game had an interesting roster that you couldn't forget, and it was a unique roster at that. You had a walking skeleton that had like the evil laugh or whatever it was. You had the cyber the cybernetic robot or whatever named Fulgore. You had Jago, who was basically a Tibetan monk but kind of looked ninja-ish. You had the female character that kind of was a little bit on the exotic side, an orchid. You had a werewolf. You had a boxer. You had a Native American with a cool mohawk that he used against you as a move, along with his tomahawks. It was like the roster was really spot on. You even had a freaking dinosaur in the shape of a velociraptor. The franchise was absolutely banging from the start. It literally came out of nowhere, and it captured everybody's attention for the reasons that I just described. There was even finishers, not to be taken as seriously as Mortal Kombat, but there were still finishers, and it was something that we enjoyed. But it was the combo in terms of the fighting game in general. It was the combo system and the combo counter, and the fact that the game kept on getting louder depending on the amount of how high your combos would go, would be something that would never ever be forgotten in a fighting game. Killer Instinct till this day is one of my favorite, if not as far as fighting game soundtracks goes, in terms of the classic fighting games, Killer Instinct is my absolute favorite soundtrack, hands down, because you can actually take this shit to a club and play it and people would dance to it. And in the new Killer Instinct, the one that we got in 2013 that got support all the way through 2017, guess what? The soundtrack from that game is great as well. That took inspiration from this old game here. As a matter of fact, back in the day when I got the Super NES version of Killer Instinct when it came out, not only did it have the black cartridge, which looked pretty damn cool, but I was also one of the first 20,000 people to get a copy of the game, and therefore I got the soundtrack for the CD. But I didn't have a CD player. Well, I did have a CD player. It was a Sega CD, and I think I did get it out to play it once, but at the same time I didn't know what to do with it. But it was really, really cool, and if I had that CD to this day, I would still play it. But obviously you can access it through different forms of media now. But the Killer Instinct soundtrack, especially when it was out in 1994 along with the game, was absolutely phenomenal, and it was one of the absolutely greatest fighting games of all time that had an impact that literally came out of nowhere. Killer Instinct is easily my number 7 of 1994. And moving on to my number 6. My number 6 it's like no wonder this is like right in the middle of this list for me, because this game is pretty much on anybody's top 10, especially if you're a casual fighting game enthusiast. This is easily your top 10, hands down, because the first game of that series had an incredible roster, and it took a basic concept and brought it to life and let fans run with it. The second game took it a few steps further, and what do I mean? It expanded on that roster, and guess what? It went from 2-on-2 to 3-on-3, which allowed people to do even more and to create even crazier combos and super moves, and combine the super moves and air combos and all that kind of stuff, with furthering the combinations of their favorite characters from both Marvel and Capcom. Yes, my number 6 is Marvel vs. Capcom 2. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is that game that everybody of the early 2000s or whatnot will always remember. It was a game that had a really big, strong, passionate fan base from both a competitive standpoint as well as a casual standpoint. And the fact that you could take any combination of this giant roster of characters and put them together, your ultimate dream roster, against another 3 of Ultimate Dream roster of any kind whatsoever, was just a blast. It was a blast to watch. It was a blast to play. And it really was a big thing back in those days. As simple of a concept as it was, getting all those characters all in one game and basically letting the fans let loose is something that is a very basic and simple concept, but it happened, and it happened at the right time, and both competitive players and casual players absolutely loved it. It was fun to play at home, it was fun to play in the arcades, and it was one of those games that you would never ever forget. And that is why Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is my number 6. Now, number 5 is a game that is very, very, very dear to my heart. Number 5 I would describe as the ultimate love letter. The ultimate love letter to Mortal Kombat fans. And before saying what that title is, everybody here that is familiar with Mortal Kombat will already know what I'm talking about. The ultimate love letter that retold the story from Mortal Kombat's 1, 2, and 3 with better graphics, obviously, with a full-on story mode, with content up the wazoo back during the Xbox 360 era. My number 5 is Mortal Kombat 9, or Mortal Kombat 2011. There was the crypt. There were the roster was excellent. The damn near perfect, if I say so myself. Probably the best roster out of any Mortal Kombat game by far. It was the first Mortal Kombat game to be competitive on Evo, like to actually have a competitive circuit, which was great for the fighting game competitive community, right? For that series, for the Mortal Kombat series. Let's see. We had the fatalities. We had the stage fatalities. We had the old school stages from the Mortal Kombat 1, 2, and 3 era, the retelling of the story, a challenge tower that was up to 300 freaking towers, and then at the end of it you would get this ultimate reward, which was basically almost a bare naked ass Melina. And it was the introduction to the X-ray moves, to when people first saw it, you had like a whole bunch of reactions going, oh, you know, it was just priceless. It was amazing. The graphics, of course, at the time were good. The color palette, the gameplay, the retelling of the story. Some people will actually prefer the retelling of the stories of MK1, 2, and 3 over even the movies and other forms of media that have come out that Mortal Kombat has offered over the years. Mortal Kombat 2011 or Mortal Kombat 2009 was indeed the ultimate love letter. It had everything in it that you could possibly want from a Mortal Kombat fan. And not to diss Marvel vs. Capcom 3, but when Mortal Kombat came out, when Mortal Kombat 9 came out, in terms of the amount of content that it had, it absolutely blew Marvel vs. Capcom 3 out of the water. Now, Marvel vs. Capcom 3 was a more technical fighter, no doubt about that. But with that being said, Mortal Kombat in general, as an overall fighting game, and as an overall love letter to the fans, was just an absolute gem that kept people playing for so long, especially the old school fans like myself. It is the Mortal Kombat game that I have easily played the most out of in more recent times than any of the other Mortal Kombat games. The only other Mortal Kombat games that I've played more of were Mortal Kombat 1, Mortal Kombat 2, and then obviously Mortal Kombat 3 / Ultimate 3 trilogy. Those were the games that I played the most, and I put a lot of time into Deception and Deadly Alliance as well. But Mortal Kombat 9, I played even more of that. It was just excellent, and it was also a true return to the 2D realm that basically brought a lot of people back as well. And the stars were perfectly aligned, and the game had an absolute impact, and it is just a treasure to me. And that's why Mortal Kombat 9 or Mortal Kombat 2011 is my number 5. Now, there's another game that actually goes ahead of it, which is my number 4. And this game, before this game came out, this particular franchise was kind of quiet for a very long time because there would be no game that came after it. When Street Fighter Third Strike, when its life cycle ended, and then when this game Street Fighter 4 came out afterwards, there was a big time gap in between those games. And when Street Fighter 4 actually hit the ground and released, everybody played it, including myself. I bought it and I played it and I loved it. And the reason why I did was because when watching footage of the announcement of the game, not just the announcement, but footage of the gameplay and all that kind of stuff, it instantly gave me Street Fighter 2 vibes. But it was more than that. It wasn't just a prettier looking Street Fighter 2. It was a better playing Street Fighter 2. It had a whole bunch of new layers to the gameplay that just added so much more in depth. that casual players can get into fairly easily, especially if they remember Street Fighter 2. But if you were a competitive player and a pro player, there was so much more in depth to it that it was just incredible. Street Fighter 4 brought people back, and everybody played it, including non-Street Fighter players or people that hadn't played Street Fighter for a long time played that game, and I am proof of that. I played it, and I played it a lot. I played it online, I played it offline. It was a pleasure for me to play the game on an arcade mode with certain characters in order to beat it and to unlock other characters that were locked. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the soundtrack of the game. I enjoyed how the game felt. The game looked absolutely great. I enjoyed the supers. I enjoyed the ultras or whatnot. It was great. It was like a combination of my favorite parts of the Street Fighter games that I grew up playing, mainly Street Fighter 2, which was the game that I grew up playing basically first, before any other fighting game that grabbed my attention. And Street Fighter 4 literally brought me back to it. And it looked great, it played great, and it was an absolute joy to play. And it had such a huge impact at the time when it came out. It was massive. And that's why Street Fighter 4 is my number 4. Now, down to the top 3 now. My number 3 is Killer Instinct 2013 through 2017. This game went through absolutely every single hurdle that you can think of in order to get to where it ended up. It released with very little content. It was free to play but you could only play as one character. And then eventually you could just buy the other characters bit by bit, or just buy the whole game for a price that also had the original KI and KI2 attached to it as well for the full price. There were DLC characters, old and new, that would be brought in. So by the end of it, there was also a whole bunch of balancing things that they had to figure out and iron out in terms of, some characters were too overpowered, some of them were not. The soundtrack of the game was arguably even better than the original KI, even though the original KI is an absolute classic. The music of the game was brought into gameplay elements of the match. Like, for example, when you did an ultra combo, the hits would go along with the music, and it sounded great. Like, the soundtrack in and of itself was damn near perfect, but it was awesome. And it played homage to the original game, and that is something that I truly respect. And the developers just gave this game all the love they had, despite the fact that they were pressed for time. And this game actually happened because people were talking about it online for almost 2 decades, and Microsoft picked it up, and when they announced it, nobody saw it coming at E3 2013. Nobody knew that they were going to announce Killer Instinct, and they did. And people just lost their mind, lost their shit, piss and cum when they saw that trailer. I guarantee you they did. And I was surprised when I saw that. I was like, no way. And then I heard the announcer say, coming to your home in 2013 only on Xbox One. I was like, no fucking way. And then there it was, right there. And I got chills. By the end of that trailer, I got chills, especially when hearing the announcer. I was like, oh my gosh, it's the announcer. I had absolute chills, because it reminded me exactly right then and there of what Killer Instinct was. And it brought that back to me back in 2013. And it was actually when I got the Xbox One finally, it was the first game that I downloaded and played. I didn't play it very much because I was playing so many other games at the time, and fighting games for me were a thing of the past. But with that being said, I've kept my eye on the franchises and the games that I grew up playing and loving very much. And I know very well what Killer Instinct has gone through. I've watched my favorite content creators cover the game and explain the game in depth. And this game to this day has some of the best online netcode for a fighting game. And not only that, you can also find matches very quickly, more than most other fighting games actually, to my knowledge. And it's easy to get into, but very hard to master, and extremely deep on the competitive level. Playing this game on the competitive level is literally a game of chess, and literally of trying to read your opponent's mind while simultaneously trying to do your own thing and trick your own opponent. It is absolutely incredible, and I highly recommend you guys watch the Killer Instinct documentary. It's about an hour and 30 minutes or an hour 45 minutes, but it is absolutely worth every single minute of your time, and it's deserving of being watched. The game literally went through so much in order to become what it was, and to this day, It is loved by all the fans, and they want a sequel, and we have yet to get one, let alone an announcement or anything about a sequel. And Killer Instinct really deserves it, and it is actually known, it is actually debated to be, if not pretty much damn well guaranteed to be, the absolute best fighting game to come out in the last decade. And it is absolutely a phenomenon that came to us in 2013 and ended up being one of the best ever. And that's why it easily makes my top 3 at number 3. My number 2 is a game that every single time I talk about, I want to shed a tear out of complete happiness and nostalgia and the amount of impact it had on me personally. And it's a Mortal Kombat game. But which Mortal Kombat game is it specifically? Now, while Mortal Kombat 1 is the game that affected every single fighting game that we know of till this day, thanks to the rating system, and while Mortal Kombat 1 absolutely positively raised that question that was asked even in recent times, to where, do violent video games cause violence, right? It was something that it was on the news, despite the fact that there were other games that surpassed it in violence and gore. That game made the news, right? And despite the fact that that original game was hugely influential and gave us the rating system that we have now to this very day, despite the fact that there were digitized graphics and realistic looks with blood and gore and fatalities and such, from a gameplay perspective, it didn't play very well, and it didn't really sound too very well in so many aspects as well. But it did enough to put it on the map, no doubt about it. But there was one game that came after it not too long later that absolutely blew the hell up, and everybody was affected by that explosion. My number 2 goes to Mortal Kombat 2, also known as MK2. And Mortal Kombat 2, when it came out, it was bigger than the first game. It had more characters. It had more finishers. It had funny finishers in order to basically say to people, listen, yes, this game is what it is, but it's like, it's not meant to be taken seriously. It brought stage fatalities. The music and sound was better. It played better. The graphics and the color palette were better. The lore was expanded upon. The movie that came out in 1995 was influenced by Mortal Kombat 2 as well. Kitana was in the movie, in the first MK1 movie. The Wastelands of Outworld was in the first movie. And if you look at the color palette and how that looked when Johnny Cage and Liu Kang went through the portal or whatever it was, and through that tunnel, and basically ended up in Outworld in the Wastelands, guess what? It looks like the Wastelands of Outworld in one of the stages in Mortal Kombat 2. Mortal Kombat 2 was absolutely huge. It was the game that everybody, that even people that did not, that weren't into fighting games or arcade games or even video games in general, would know about, because they would find out about it either on the news, either by their kids, which, by the way, we were scouring for magazines to find out how to do finishers, and we would show up at school with these magazines, and during recess we would look at the magazines and look at the inputs and look at what the fatalities looked like and shit. That was Mortal Kombat 2. There were people crowded around this arcade cabinet and were just watching the living hell out of it. That was Mortal Kombat 2. It was just as fun to watch as it was to play, and it was so much better than the first game. And you were always wondering what would be next and what would come next. When I first saw Mortal Kombat 2, I was absolutely astounded. I did not want to leave the arcade. I did not want to leave the bowling alley. And it was the game that I would come back and play time and time again. And even when the first movie came out, which was around the same time, 3 days difference actually between that and the release of Mortal Kombat 3, I still went back and played Mortal Kombat 2 because of the original Mortal Kombat movie, because it just made you want to go back and play MK2. And MK2 is by far the definition of a true fighting game sequel to me, or just a true gaming sequel in general, because it did everything bigger, it did everything better, it looked and sounded better. Toasty made his first appearance in Mortal Kombat 2, and it really innovated on top of that. And that's why Mortal Kombat 2 is easily my number 2 on this list. And my number 1 should be obvious by now. If you know fighting games, and if you've ever played fighting games in your life, there is no way that this game is not on anybody's top 3 or top 5 list. There's just no way. Do I even have to tell you what it is? My number 1 easily goes to Street Fighter 2. Street Fighter 2 is that game that literally paved the way for every single fighting game that came after it. It was the game that people just latched onto. It was the game that grabbed everybody's attention. It was the game that was also fun to play at the time, that played very well, had an interesting, diverse cast of characters and fighters, right? It sounded really good. It played really good. There was even a point to where we went to, there was like some sort of conference party that my parents and their business partners went to way back in the day when I was like 8 years old or so. And there was this little room in this huge conference area to where little kids like myself actually gathered around. There was a little tiny TV and a Super Nintendo, and guess what game they were playing? They were playing Street Fighter 2, and whoever would lose would have to pass up the controller. It was amazing. And I quickly found out that I wasn't the best player at Street Fighter 2 either, but maybe that's another video for another time. Street Fighter 2 paved the way for all fighting games in general. Simple as that. How in the world can this not be on anybody's top 10 list, let alone, you know, top 3 probably, maybe. The greatest fighting game of all time is Street Fighter 2, and that is as simple as that, and it is also one of my personal favorites, and it is the very first fighting game that I ever played, and I played it for a long time before Mortal Kombat caught my eye, and even after Mortal Kombat caught my eye. There were different variations of this game that came out, because back in the day there were no patches, so you would have the World Warrior, and then you would have Turbo, and then you would have, what was it, the Championship Edition and stuff like that. There were different editions of the game, and Street Fighter 2 was just incredible. Yeah, the greatest fighting game of all time is Street Fighter 2, and that is my top 10 personal fighting games of all time, greatest fighting games of all time. So let me know down in the comments section what your list is, what you guys think, and what games had the biggest impact on you. What are your favorites? And obviously there are games on here that deserve to be on this list if it was just the greatest fighting games of all time, such as one of the Smash Brothers games, for instance, or maybe a Tekken game. But the thing is, I didn't play those games, as well as Soul Calibur games, and the thing is, even if I did play them, I didn't play them enough in order to get a feel for them and to give an accurate, genuine feeling of what I felt about those games. But this is my list, and just a quick review. My number 10 was Mortal Kombat Deception. My number 9 was Marvel vs. Capcom. Virtual Fighter 2 was my number 8. My number 7 is Killer Instinct of 1994. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 was my number 6. Number 5 was Mortal Kombat 9. Number 4 was Street Fighter 4. Number 3 was Killer Instinct of 2013 through 2017. My number 2 was Mortal Kombat 2. And my number 1 is Street Fighter 2. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you guys on the next one.